Hello, and welcome to the National Capital Planning Commission's first live video Q&A. I'm Sarah Moulton, Urban Planner with NCPC. And joining me today is Walter Hood, Professor at UC Berkeley, their Landscape Architecture and Environmental Design Department, and Principal of Hood Design in Oakland, California. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
So just wanted to give you some background on Hood Design. They're committed to the design and construction of communities, landscapes where inhabitants share physical, social, political, and economic resources collectively. This multidimensional context forces the development of powerful sculpted expressions that explore site-specific social and environmental processes. Landscapes emerge as improvised acts. A familiar context is reshaped into something new. So that's Walter's approach, and he's applied this to the design of urban landscapes across the U.S., from Green Street Plaza to Center Street in Berkeley, to the Green Print Urban Design Landscape Vision for the Hill District in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we're looking forward to hearing about all of those today and then some. And right now, NCPC is in the process of preparing a new urban design element for the comp plan. So later today, Walter will be sticking around and sharing his expertise and ideas with the Urban Design Task Force for developing that new element. So again, thanks for being here, and also to everyone out in the Twitterverse and online, feel free to submit any questions to us, anything you'd like to ask Walter. The hashtag for Twitter would be Q4WHood. So let's just dive right into it. First question, we wanted to ask you some kind of Washington-specific questions. It's certainly a different environment than what you typically see out west in Oakland. And we were wondering if you have a favorite space in Washington, and if you do, what makes it successful from your point of view?
I guess my favorite space in Washington, D.C. would be the mall. And what makes it fantastic is its scale, and that every time I go there, I never know who I'm going to run into. Meaning the diversity of people. And the people tend to be this sort of cross-section of Americana, which is, emblematic of this place.
Yeah, yeah. And there aren't too many places that you find that in Washington, right?
Not that's open. And I think the quality of the mall is unlike Rock Creek Park or going to some of the smaller squares or even the sort of neighborhood squares and circles is that it's vast. It's literally like being in a Leno landscape, a large French landscape where you can see people and where people gather. And I think that's one of, again, the very sort of basic meaning of a kind of a democratic sort of landscape is where people literally are seen and they become objectified.
It's one of the challenges of the National Mall too, because of its vast expanse. There are definitely a lot of times during the year that it's underutilized. How are there ways to kind of activate that in smaller spaces and smaller groups?
Well, I guess that's one of the big questions in landscape architecture is programming. And I guess I'm of the mind some spaces need to be silent sometimes, and sometimes they need to be gregarious. And I think the mall is one of those spaces. I don't think the kind of landscape that it presents for the nation and even for the capital, it needs to sort of transform itself to our, our daily whims of wanting to be maybe refuge. I think there are other spaces that can do that. Yeah. Spiro Kostoff writes about empty space. And there's something about that power. So even though the mall at times has a change in its density, I think we have to be very careful in trying to make it active all the time. And there's something very American about that.
All of the activity, the expectation.
We want to know what goes on and who's doing it and how do they do it. If you go around the world, the piazzas of Rome, they're empty a lot of the times, and people can do many different things. And it's I think it's our fear of the unknown, and that's from, really thinking of a heterogeneous society versus one that's more homogeneous.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm sure, as you know, in D.C., there are tons of federal public spaces, not just the National Mall, and there is that kind of expectation to plan and have it active all the time, but that's not always the case. So what are those kind of important values and characteristics in those kind of federal spaces, not necessarily the spaces for the community, but for the nation. What are those characteristics that should start to define those federal places, those federal spaces?
Well, I think it starts, one, with just being open. I think it was back in 1877, I think, maybe a little earlier, where I think Congress, that there was a push against sort of putting fences around public spaces. And I think it failed at the time, but I think we are at a place where those spaces are not fenced off. I'm delighted at times when I come to DC and I see people of all walks of life in those spaces, and sometimes they're the people who are outside of the norm. They're there, but I appreciate that they have the opportunity to be in those spaces. But I think the number one thing is the connective tissue. I think L'Enfant's plan is at this other scale, the scale of the region, and people live in smaller scale spaces. We walk down streets, we use public transportation, we play with our kids, and so that connective tissue is something I think that we're not really that good at yet. And I think it's because we're very young as a country, but I also think that we haven't had a lot of practice in knitting those things together. Again, this idea of always saying what a space should be sometimes gets in the way of just saying, let's make something beautiful and let's connect A to B.
Yeah. Well, kind of on that note, we've talked about some of the challenges that we face in Washington. What are some of the strengths that you see here in our public spaces?
You have a plan. I mean, really, if you look at the city, there's such a resilient urban morphology that's been pushed against and is still here, which means that there is some power to it that you can add to it, you can adapt it. And I'll speak later today about, how should we adapt it? Is it just, letting the axes go out, or is it much more sort of this incremental transfer of making the squares, the spaces, the parks kind of move out and become more broad. But again, like a great piece of music, you can just keep improvising with what you have because there's something that's so strong and tangible what you have.
I'm glad you hit on music. That was one thing I did want to ask you about. You're very well known for kind of messy, free-flowing spaces, and when I look at your work and also other people that work here with me at NCPC, we hear and feel jazz. And I was wondering if music or other arts ever influence your work.
Oh, of course, and I hope everybody has those sort of external influences. But, I spoke of structure when we think of the L'Enfant plan, and I've taken music courses where over and over, the pedagogy is really about structure and how to break from structure and being able to become virtuoso with the structure. And in landscape, as you know, there are landscapes that we can look at, from the French gardens to the Italian gardens to the English gardens and even to the more modern gardens, and they have bones. And really understanding that each one of them really needs, to sort of be very definitively tied down to the ground. And then you can break away in many different ways, because in every generation there's going to be new needs and new wants, and hopefully we can make those kinds of landscapes for each generation to sort of build on, so a palimpsest actually arrives, which is jazz, which is this sort of call and response, which is a kind of dynamic, sort of conversation over time.
You mentioned that there's kind of the idea of building generationally, building these landscapes, and it's definitely something that's been in the kind of landscape architecture discussion lately is, how do we take these modernist spaces that were built, 40, 50 plus years ago, and kind of rework them for today? Are there any projects that you've worked on or familiar with where they've kind of restored or redesigned something that kind of already has those bones and applied it to today? Yeah,
I think Bryant Park is in New York is a really good example by Laurie Olin. I think we've worked on things like Lafayette Square in Oakland, California, very kind of modernist, I would say 20th century sort of traditional strolling park that then becomes a kind of an open plan. I think you see it in New York now. Diller Scofidio just finished this great piece, a transformation of Kylie's work. You see it again in Philadelphia, I think on the Mall. Laurie, again, transforming Kylie's work. And it's that conversation. I think that's a really healthy thing. It's like, how do you, I think we have to sort of be willing to have a conversation versus, you know, we're very good about not having a conversation and just wiping the slate clean. But this idea of looking backwards and saying, I wonder what Royston was thinking when he was doing this. We're working on a Royston project now in San Francisco, and you know, there's a high level of respect for the work, but there's also an understanding of the people who live there need new things. And so we're trying to just find that point where you can make a really beautiful collaborative sort of conversation. So I think that's something that, you know, we should sort of relish in a way.
And that collaboration sometimes is challenging. You get people, especially in situations with more historic or, you know, landscapes that have been there for a generation plus. You get folks that don't want it to change.
Right.
So how do you bring them into the conversation?
Well, you know, society tends to sort of create these canons where, you know, these absolutes. This is a work of art, like, and that work of art should stay. And that's something collectively I think we can have that conversation about. And there are some places, some buildings, and some landscapes that are constructed that I think that's a healthy conversation. But then again, not everything's a masterpiece in the same way, and not everything can we agree on collectively. And so I think that's a starting point. But that's always a struggle, and it's always been a struggle with people, right?
Yeah.
We have differences, but we have to figure out ways of arriving at new solutions.
We've been getting some live feed questions from folks on the internet. I want to make sure to include some of these. Kevin was wondering how you balance the need for passive and active uses when designing an urban space.
How do you balance? That's a good question, Kevin. It depends on the kind of space. I talk a lot with my students, and I've written some about typologies, American urban space typologies. And I think, again, we're not critical enough, I think, in the profession to sort of think about, well, what constitutes those public spaces? We have streets, we have squares, we have parks, we have gardens, we have infrastructure, and we used to have a thing called wilderness, right? These wild spaces. And the kind of contestation of those spaces have dwindled them down, so the nomenclature means nothing anymore. I mean, parks have gone through an amazing transformation in the 20th century, from reform to everything but open space. And so now, you know, if Downing and, you know, Olmsted argued, you know, parks should at least be, you know, for the city of New York, a minimum of 500 acres, you now see parks that are 10 by 20.
Right.
So it's really hard to make a decision then about what's passive, what's active, if we can't have that discussion about, well, what are those kinds of spaces? Because, you know, maybe is it parks are more active than plazas? Maybe plazas are more active than parks. But that's, again, a question that I think we can hopefully be more articulate about as we think about building our cities, because each one acts in a different way. It would be great to return back to a park, to think about, well, the mission of a park. What is the role of a park? You know, is a park just another space, another green space, or is it something that's tied more to a set of values and goals for ecological democracy? That's yet to, again, to be sort of talked about.
Are parks your favorite type of landscape to design? Or I know you mentioned, you know, there's streetscapes and everything in between. What's your
landscapes are my favorite.
Yeah.
I try to stay away from the nomenclature sort of subdivision, because, again, when I get a client and they say, design this park, I immediately go, let's not call it a park. Right. Let's just look at it as a landscape, and what do you want that landscape to be? If it ends up being a park, it's a park.
Yeah. Yeah, so be it. And you know, parks sometimes can live on streets.
Yes, yes.
So it's that kind of active passive that you were talking about.
Well, it gets to this notion of hybridity.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, again, the critique might be made that, are we at a time where those spaces are or should collapse on one another, and should there be no type, right? But that, again, is something that we have to be aware of. And I mean, I argue more for hybridity versus the sterile type, because they allow you then to look specifically at a place and a time and say, well, this is what this needs to be. So.
Another question from Patricia. Are there any new design projects in the city of DC and on the National Mall that you'd most like to design?
Well, there are there's a lot of competitions coming up. I would love to redesign all of Washington, D.C.
Start from scratch?
Not start from scratch, start from where we are.
Okay.
I've been looking lately at just the plans of the entire district. I think one of the fantastic things about DC and NCPC is that it's not only the federal government, but you have a local landscape here. And from its beginnings, from its origin, there's always been this supposedly a conversation between the two. And the local was supposed to benefit from the national. And also the national was supposed to participate and actually make the spaces around each one of the 15 squares, which is a kind of interesting way, right? Now we have, more than that,
right.
Can we get, local to actually be states to actually come and actually have conversations about what the national capital should be. So I think would be a fantastic process that you guys are already approaching.
Well, you mentioned kind of involving not just the local community, but the national community in designing space. Do you think kind of that lack of, or that challenge in getting local areas and national, communities outside of the DC area to interact with that, do you think that's a challenge or shortcoming, something that we need to focus on more?
I think it would be a great addition to how we think of the city, because then the city means more. It means more to me out in California. It means more to the person out in Colorado, the person out in Texas, or the person in Chicago. When you come here, there's a connection. It's no different than every city in this country has sister cities somewhere in the world, right? San Francisco is in Osaka. Right. You go there and you have something from San Francisco and vice versa. And I think having that exchange, we have representatives. It might have a different dialogue in how we talk about contested space. And now with the movement, the occupation movement now, it would then have a stronger resonance in places as people were sort of speaking out in Berkeley, in Los Angeles, in Washington. It would reverberate back here to DC, and it could possibly do that in powerful ways.
One space that's talked about a lot in DC that has the potential to do that is Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm sure you're familiar with all the squares and parks that line the street. Is that anything, or is that an idea that you would consider redesigning as part of the larger L'Enfant plan?
Well, Pennsylvania Avenue is that one spine where it's truly, even today, this summer I walked up and down Pennsylvania Avenue going back and forth to the Smithsonian. I had a fellowship there, and I was really blown away by who was there, the people. At Freedom Plaza, there was events going on daily, some protesting. There was the local transient community parked out under the alley of trees. There were the fortified federal buildings on one side. But, there's this fantastic mix of social life, but also a certain physicality. And then when you look in both directions, seeing the Capitol building, there's something that it does to you. So yes, I think that would be a fantastic place to begin, because most people would come here and they would actually experience that.
We've talked a little bit about Washington, but I'm curious as to know what your favorite city is, and so is Jonathan J., who just submitted a question.
Jonathan J. Make sure I don't know Jonathan in the city that he's talking about. I love cities. I mean, I don't tend to have a preference. I love cities because, again, for a lot of the traits that I just talked about, they're diverse, they're ever-changing. New York is one of my favorite cities. Over the last 5 years, I've gotten to know Chicago a lot better. In past time, I've spent time in Seattle. I'm doing work in Los Angeles, Mexico City. I mean, I just keep going.
Yeah.
But just visiting a city is never enough. Once you spend time there, you get to know its heartbeat, and it's pretty special and pretty fantastic. And that goes back to the question of how do we design and how do we make place. And I think we have to sort of be willing to kind of look beneath the surface of places where we design. And my students are always asking me, how can you design in another place? You don't know it. But you have to find ways to know it. And spending time helps on one hand, but also being a keen observer, you know, and being appreciative of difference, of things that you might not know, and then finding ways to sort of know it. But I don't have a favorite.
Okay, fair enough.
But I love them all. I mean, when I left to come here, someone in my studio said, "But you love DC," and I'm like, "Yes, I love DC." I started my career here 30 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Actually, with the National Capital, with the National Park Service.
Oh, great,
So,
great.
so I have strong feelings for DC.
And you're from North Carolina,
Carolina,
right?
yeah.
Charlotte area.
Yeah.
So you're familiar with the East Coast.
Oh, I'm from the East
right.
Coast. It's because I've been out west.
Yeah, but you practice mainly, I mean, I know your studio's out west, obviously your projects are international. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of the East Coast versus West Coast kind of design ethos? I know there's a big difference. You come to DC and it's very structured and regimented, maybe not so much up in other cities along the East Coast, but West Coast seems so free-form and you don't see that so much out here. And I was wondering why you think that is.
It's youth. You know, West Coast is very young. You don't have this this built-up tradition where people are expected to act a certain way and be a certain way. And I felt that when I was on the East Coast. I came up from North Carolina, ended up in Washington, D.C., worked here for a while, went to Philadelphia, worked in Philly, and then went to New York, worked in places in New York. And I felt very stifled within the profession. When I looked around, I didn't see a lot that related to me. I didn't see people at the time asking the questions that were relevant to me. And then I went out west, and I met this guy named Garrett Ekbo, and he was talking everything. It was amazing. He was talking about me, some of the issues, and no one then cared what I was doing. And that was one of the biggest sort of things about the West Coast was there seems not to be this how can I say frame that holds you into certain categories. People look at you and go, "Oh, you do that, great." Versus I think on the East Coast, you tend to sort of be put in separate camps. And it's very easy. People want to identify you with different things. And I just think the youth of the West, you know, the kind of the Wild West, that it allows you to sort of be in your own space and not be sort of defined from the outside.
One thing that the West Coast has really grasped earlier than the rest, I think, of the nation, although we're catching up, is that concept of sustainability. And I was wondering, this is a question from Shireen, you know, what's the role of landscape architecture and the profession as a whole when it comes to urban sustainability? Are we the torchbearers for this, or?
I hope we're not the torchbearers, because that's a heavy burden. Yeah. You know, I think we'll just break our backs. But I do think we're in the position to get people to see the world around them. And, you know, we cannot talk about ecological democracy, sustainability, any of these sort of buzzwords until we get people to recognize they live on an island, they live in a floodplain, they live in a swamp, they live in a riverine valley. Until we, again, as landscape designers, architects, until we get people to sort of see that, they're not going to respond in the way that's symbiotic, that you have to respond. If the waters are high, you go to high ground. You don't try to keep the waters back. And so what we find is our environments are sort of created in this very homogeneous way, and you forget where you are. You know, sometimes I go, God, I haven't been to the beach in 6 months. I live 3 miles from the ocean.
Oh.
Right, and so it's so easy for you not to see it because your immediate environment is like every other environment. So I would say it starts there, and design can do that. And I've seen and experienced places through design that, you know, allowed me to go, okay, tread lightly here.
And it's definitely an important component environmentally. You know, another component of sustainability is also the social equity component that I know that a lot of your work has focused heavily on. Now, how do you start to weave the social equity issues into public spaces?
Well, that's the thorny question.
Yeah.
I've come to think that design cannot solve those things, those issues. Those are larger societal issues. whether we have 10% unemployment, that means that there's a lot of people in public space. When we have low unemployment, that means there's a lot of people in other kinds of spaces. And so some things you can care towards, but I think for me the biggest thing is, how can I give beauty to everyone? So if I'm working with someone who has less, I am not going to give them less through my efforts. And so there's a kind of an equitable, distribution of talent then to a certain degree. And I would wish, those of us who have the ability to work for certain clients and, do certain things that get written up in the magazines, why can't we put in the same amount of time in those places that desperately need it? And who cares about being in the magazine? And again, I think that's a very personal thing that one has to sort of accept.
There's definitely a difference between kind of private clients and local government clients. I was wondering if you think there's also a difference between kind of local government and federal government.
Oh, yeah.
How so?
Money. No, I'm just kidding. They're both large bureaucracies where you have, and this is one of the critiques from a lot of people of working for government, is that it just takes so long to do anything, and then you have to go through so many channels and steps to get approval, and by the time you get there, you're out of business, right? And so there's one is the bureaucracy of how we actually do the work. But the other thing is the local government is much more attuned to what's going on there, but they're somehow related through the bureaucracy. And on one hand, it would be great if there was a loss of the bureaucracy to a certain degree that allowed for that work to get done locally. And there are certain cities that have, figured out ways to sort of work within that context. But, by the time one deals with low bid, in Oakland we have, you have to have local people participate. By the time you have all the layers of regulatory issues on top, the brightest and the best don't want to actually do it. Bloomberg actually in New York did something really interesting after 9/11. He said, for small offices who want to do work in the city, we'll handle all the clerical work, right? And so offices could then compete with the large offices who could deal with the clerical.
Right.
But just to fill out the forms, to get the job,
it can be challenging.
Takes, if you're a 3-person firm or a 4-person firm, forget it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's a challenge. Let's see, we've got one other question from Peggy. If you're familiar with the L'Enfant Plaza, Banneker Overlook, the Park Promenade, are you familiar with that area down in Southwest? It's a park that overlooks the Washington Channel and down near the Southwest waterfront. She was wondering if you have any ideas for a redesign for that space.
Oh, God.
And that kind of gets back also to that, what we were talking about earlier, there was a space that was designed back in the 60s. It served a certain purpose at that time, but things have changed. Right. And how do you respect that original design but make it current?
Well, I think you have to look at the new uses, that are there. But let me go back to this idea of, I'm not saying that everything needs to be preserved, but if there's a respect for the palimpsest, though, that this idea that we spent money at a certain time to build something. When we come in as a designer, we just haul it off as if there's no worth there. But I think to build a city, we need to sort of understand what's of value. So if it's the retaining wall, if it's the sidewalk, that there's something left behind for you then to have this conversation with. So it's not always a set of empirical ideas or some lofty conceptual idea. A lot of times it's just practical stuff that I can use this for ballast or, that I can actually use it. But again, that's not something that's practiced and promoted because they'll tell you it costs more money to preserve this than to rip it out and put it back in.
Sure.
But it's an ethic. It's an ethic because, again, the conversation is, well, what were they thinking? And not all modernism, modernism was a special period in this country where there was optimism. And there was optimism to the point where, it kind of were overwrought, in a way in building. But it still speaks of an optimism of when we thought that we could do things in a very different way, and we could sort of have this equity in a certain way, and we were free. And we forget that that's a big component of it. We just look and go, oh, those are some ugly planters, or, but that's a time when people thought about play in a different way. I think about Friedberg, and I think of all these people who had these ideas for a society that was more open than it is today. And so today we've sort of lost a lot of that optimism. But when I work on modern projects done in the 50s or the 30s, that spirit just engulfs you. So how can you not be optimistic?
And it's something to bring on to that next iteration for the space.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, we have time for one more question, and this one's from Elizabeth. The question is, landscapes mature and evolve. So what are your thoughts on how to preserve important works of landscape architecture when the spaces and the context change?
That was twofold.
It is.
I mean, one is, we recognize that the environment is constantly changing. If we're still within those environments, then we have a role then in its transformation. As far as climax, I mean, do we replant the same thing? Do we learn from that planting and move into a completely different direction? I think we have to get over the fear of that change. When you look at the early images of the mall, there was a lot of trees there that they cut down and planted new ones.
Right.
So someone had that conviction. Of course, there were a lot of people who were upset. But with change comes responsibility to a certain degree. So, I think it's not about preservation to a certain degree. It's more about conservation, maybe even about reservation. But the idea that, it stands still in time, I think particularly in an environment like here in the Potomac, which is this kind of rich fluvial landscape that wants to change, and it wants to change in ways that we don't even know. Right? And to me, that's the beauty of what we do, is this kind of those unforeseen acts that could be encouraged to happen, that could, in 10 years you go, oh my God, I didn't know, that would manifest. And to me, that's the beauty of landscape versus building. The building, we know everything, we have to control it because we're keeping the outside from inside. The outside is, we're trying to propagate and make it bountiful to a certain degree, but again, we're still controlling it. We're acting as if it's a building.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. But Walter, I wanted to thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is a good conversation.
And thank you, Twitters.
Yes, thank you, Twitterverse, and those folks that were on the internet also watching today. So just to let you know, today's conversation, it will help inform the development of the comprehensive plan, the federal elements of the comprehensive plan for DC. And specifically, we'll be talking this afternoon about the urban design element. And if you want to learn more or share your thoughts, just go ahead and visit ncpc.com/urban design for more information. And to learn more about upcoming events that we have here at NCPC, including tomorrow's discussion on housing and transportation affordability with Art Rogers, go ahead and visit our website too. So for now, I'm Sarah Moulton. Thanks again for tuning in, and you've been watching NCPC Live.